Something has snapped in Kaliningrad, and Putin cannot fix it with a phone call, a missile, or a threat. For the first time since the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia's most heavily armed piece of territory in Europe is being strangled not by tanks, not by an invasion, but by paperwork, border gates, and a power switch flipped 18 months ago in Vilnius. Kaliningrad sits between Poland and Lithuania, cut off from mainland Russia by hundreds of kilometers of NATO territory. And every single road, every rail line, every power cable that keeps that exclave alive runs through countries that now consider Moscow a direct threat. Putin built this region into an unsinkable fortress, packed with S-400 air defense batteries, nuclear-capable Iskander missiles, and the headquarters of Russia's Baltic Fleet. And now that fortress is the single most exposed, most surrounded, most quietly vulnerable piece of land, Russia controls anywhere on Earth. Poland knows it. Lithuania knows it. And in the last few months, Warsaw has started closing the noose, not with soldiers, but with something far harder for the Kremlin to fight back against. What's happening right now to Kaliningrad is not a single dramatic event that made headlines for one day and disappeared. It's a slow, layered squeeze that has been building since early 2025, and it's accelerating fast. Border crossings shut down, a power grid severed, sanctioned cargo banned from transit, a consulate closed, a fortification line rising along the frontier, and behind all of it, a question that Moscow's own generals are reportedly asking in private. What happens if NATO decides to finish the job? By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Kaliningrad, the crown jewel of Russia's western defenses, has quietly become Putin's biggest liability, and why there's almost nothing he can do about it without triggering the one thing he's desperate to avoid. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what Kaliningrad actually is, because most people who watch this war unfold think of it as just another region on the map. It isn't. Kaliningrad is what's called a semi-exclave, a chunk of Russian territory roughly half the size of Belgium, home to about 1 million people, sitting more than 300 kilometers from the Russian mainland with no land connection to it at all. It used to be German Königsberg before the Soviets annexed it after World War II, and ever since, Moscow has treated it as a forward operating base pointed directly at the heart of Europe. This is where Russia stations its Baltic Fleet. This is where Iskander-M missile systems, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, sit within easy striking range of Warsaw, Berlin, and every Baltic capital. For decades, Western planners called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a permanent dagger aimed at NATO's northeastern flank. But a dagger only works if the hand holding it can also feed it, fuel it, and supply it. And that's exactly where Kaliningrad's entire strategic logic starts to collapse, because everything that keeps that fortress running has to pass through the territory of the two countries Russia has spent the last 4 years turning into enemies. Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, this dependency wasn't really a problem. Poland and Lithuania were tense neighbors, sure, but the borders were open, the trade flowed, and Kaliningrad's supply lines were treated as a normal functioning part of regional commerce. Freight moved by rail through Lithuania. Electricity flowed through a Soviet-era grid that had bound Kaliningrad, the Baltic states, Belarus, and Russia together since the 1960s. Consulates operated. Tourists crossed. It was, by regional standards, unremarkable. Fast forward to August 2026, and almost none of that infrastructure works the way it used to. Every single link in Kaliningrad's supply chain has either been cut, restricted, or placed under the direct control of a NATO government that no longer trusts Moscow even slightly. That's the transformation we're talking about today, and it started with something most people outside the region barely noticed: a power switch. On the morning of February 8th, 2025, in Vilnius, Lithuania, a 9-meter clock counted down to 0 in the center of the city, and when it hit 0, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania physically severed their last electrical connection to the Russian-controlled grid known as BREL, the Soviet-era system that had synchronized their power with Moscow for over 6 decades. It sounds like a technical footnote. It wasn't. Lithuanian Energy Minister Žygimantas Vaičiūnas put it plainly at the time, saying the move removed any theoretical possibility of Russia using control of the electricity grid as a weapon against the Baltic states. But here's the part that actually matters for Kaliningrad. Because of that desynchronization, Kaliningrad's power system lost its grid connection to mainland Russia entirely. The exclave, wedged between 2 NATO members with no land border to the rest of the country, became what regional planners now call an energy island. Moscow saw this coming for years and tried to prepare. Between 2019 and 2024, Russia ran 5 separate isolated operation tests in Kaliningrad to prove the region could survive on its own power. It built 3 new gas-fired power plants, a floating liquefied natural gas terminal, and a coal-fired plant specifically to make the exclave self-sufficient if this exact scenario happened. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov dismissed the concerns publicly, insisting Russia had taken all measures to ensure the uninterrupted, reliable operation of its unified energy system. But insisting something is fine, and it actually being fine, are two very different things when you're an island of 1 million people sitting between two countries that no longer want anything to do with you. And the electricity cut was only the opening move, because right behind it came something far more damaging to Kaliningrad's actual economy: the slow, deliberate strangling of what gets to cross the border at all. In October 2025, Poland and Lithuania began strictly enforcing existing European Union sanctions along their land corridors into Kaliningrad, effectively severing the primary supply routes for anything Brussels had already restricted. This wasn't a blockade in the military sense. Nobody deployed troops to physically stop trucks. Instead, Warsaw and Vilnius invoked specific articles of the EU treaty and simply enforced the rules that were already on the books, filtering the cargo with surgical precision. Food and medicine, the basic human necessities, kept moving. But cement, metal, coal, machine parts, high-tech components, and luxury consumer goods were banned outright from transiting Polish and Lithuanian territory into the exclave. Think about what that actually means for a region that houses a militarized Baltic fleet and an ongoing fortification effort of its own. Machine parts feed weapons maintenance. High-tech components feed radar and communication systems. Construction material feeds military infrastructure. By simply enforcing sanctions rules that already existed on paper, two NATO governments managed to choke off nearly everything sustaining Kaliningrad's military and civilian economy without firing a single shot or declaring anything close to a blockade. Analysts covering the move described it as a strategic use of bureaucracy to isolate the exclave, and that description is almost uncomfortably accurate. There is no dramatic footage of this kind of siege. There's just a stamp that doesn't get approved, a truck that gets turned around, a shipment that quietly disappears from the manifest. Then came January 2026, and Poland tightened the vice again. On the night of January 6th, the Polish Interior Ministry suspended traffic through 10 separate land border crossings, 2 of them directly linking Poland to Kaliningrad at Gronowo and Godap, and the other 8 along the Belarusian frontier. The official justification cited temporary security reasons tied to persistent, irregular migration pressure and heightened geopolitical tension in the border zone. Only humanitarian convoys were allowed through. Everything else, passenger traffic, freight, tourism, simply stopped. And here's the detail that should tell you everything about how Poland intends to run this going forward. The closures are reviewed every 30 days, with no fixed timeline for reopening. That means Warsaw has built itself a rolling, renewable lever it can tighten or loosen at will month after month, indefinitely, without ever having to justify a permanent decision. Logistics companies that used to route freight straight through these crossings now have to divert through Lithuanian corridors or the Gdansk ferry, adding as much as 300 extra kilometers and a fresh layer of customs formalities to every shipment. For an exclave already running on emergency power infrastructure and sanctioned goods restrictions, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a slow economic chokehold, applied one 30-day review cycle at a time. And then Moscow tried to hit back the only way it still could, diplomatically. In what officials described as a mirror response, Russia announced it would close the Polish consulate in Kaliningrad starting August 29th, directly retaliating against Poland's earlier closure of the Russian consulate in Krakow. That Krakow closure hadn't come out of nowhere. Poland shut it down after gathering evidence that Russian special services were involved in an arson attack on a Warsaw shopping center back in 2024. When asked how Warsaw would respond to Russia's retaliatory consulate closure, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Paweł Wronski confirmed an adequate response was coming, though he wouldn't specify what form it would take or when. Notice the asymmetry here. Poland's original move was rooted in a concrete accusation of sabotage on its own soil. Russia's response was purely reactive, a diplomatic tit-for-tat that cost Moscow one more channel of communication and visibility into a region it desperately needs to understand better, not less. Every consulate that closes is one more set of eyes and ears that Russia loses inside a rapidly shifting security environment right on its most exposed border. Wronski's own framing was clear on this point. Poland is not taking action against the Russian state itself, but against specific security threats. That distinction might sound like diplomatic hair-splitting, but it matters because it tells you Warsaw isn't trying to provoke an open confrontation. It's trying to methodically remove every soft lever Russia has left, one bureaucratic decision at a time, while staying carefully below the threshold that would justify a harder Russian response. It's worth pausing here to understand just how militarized this small patch of land actually is, because that's what makes its current vulnerability so strategically significant. Kaliningrad hosts the headquarters of Russia's Baltic fleet, along with submarines, surface combatants, and coastal defense units. It hosts the 11th Army Corps, a reinforced ground formation built specifically to defend the exclave and threaten the surrounding NATO states simultaneously. Iskander-M mobile missile systems, capable of striking targets more than 500 kilometers away with either conventional or nuclear warheads, rotate through the region regularly, putting Warsaw, Berlin, Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn all within range from Russian territory that technically sits deep inside NATO's own borders. Layer on top of that S-400 air defense batteries designed to deny NATO aircraft access to a large chunk of Baltic airspace, and you start to understand why Western planners have spent 2 decades calling Kaliningrad an anti-access area denial bubble, a zone Russia could theoretically use to blind and slow any NATO reinforcement effort in the opening hours of a crisis. Every few years, Russia has run massive military exercises across this region and neighboring Belarus under the Zapad banner, rehearsing exactly the kind of rapid mobilization that would matter most if the Suwalki corridor ever became a real battlefield rather than a hypothetical one. That's the paradox sitting at the center of this entire story. Kaliningrad is simultaneously one of the most heavily armed pieces of ground in Europe and one of the most logistically fragile, because all of that weaponry still needs fuel, spare parts, food for the people stationed there, and a functioning economy underneath it. And every single one of those things now depends on the goodwill of 2 governments Moscow has spent the last 4 years alienating. Now here's where we need to pause and be honest about something, because a one-sided story convinces nobody who's paying attention. Kaliningrad hasn't been physically blockaded in the way that word usually implies. There are no warships enforcing a maritime cordon. There is no NATO armored column parked on the border. Border crossings, even the ones still technically open, continue to function, and even at their worst, Kaliningrad residents wait in queues, not in permanent closures. Analysts covering the region have repeatedly stressed that there are currently no real signs of an imminent land invasion being planned from Poland or Lithuania, and that European naval capabilities in the Baltic, while growing, remain limited, even accounting for how badly degraded Russia's own Baltic fleet has become. This is not, right now, a shooting war. What it is, though, is something arguably more dangerous for Moscow's long-term planning, because you don't need to seize Kaliningrad or fully blockade it to make it hurt. Given its geography, even a single disrupted supply line already ripples through the entire regional economy. That's the real story here. Poland doesn't need tanks. It needs customs officers, 30-day review clauses, and a power grid that no longer answers to Moscow. So why is Poland doing all of this now, layering closure after closure, restriction after restriction? Because underneath the consulate spats and the border paperwork sits a far bigger, far more consequential project that's been quietly under construction since 2024, and it's the real reason this squeeze on Kaliningrad isn't going to loosen anytime soon. It's called East Shield, Tartsów Shad in Polish, and it is the largest fortification effort along Poland's borders since 1945. Announced by Prime Minister Donald Tusk in May 2024, East Shield is designed to fortify roughly 800 kilometers of Poland's northern and eastern frontier, covering both the Kaliningrad border and the frontier with Belarus. We're talking about a comprehensive system of physical barriers, anti-tank obstacles, bunkers, minefield provisions, advanced surveillance networks, and a dedicated anti-drone system, all built to NATO's eastern flank specification. The publicly disclosed price tag sits at around 25 billion Polish zloty, close to 6 billion euros, though Poland has submitted more than 24 individual East Shield projects worth an additional 10 billion euros under the EU's Safe Defense Funding Program, part of the broader Rearm Europe initiative. Between October 2024 and mid-July 2026, Poland completed 61 kilometers of defensive lines under this program. That might sound underwhelming given the 800-kilometer target, and some analysts have said exactly that. French military analyst Clément Mollin publicly criticized the pace of construction along the Kaliningrad border specifically, noting that only a few kilometers of fortifications had been completed there, leaving key access roads still unprotected. Polish outlets have even flagged that some of the completed sections lack proper camouflage, visible clearly on satellite imagery. But 2026 is described by Poland's own defense ministry as the decisive, intensive phase of the project. Officials say more than 200 additional kilometers, including 20 kilometers of hardened physical barriers, are scheduled for completion this year alone, alongside a major expansion of the anti-drone detection network. And critically, this is no longer just a Polish project. Starting in mid-2026, Allied forces began joining the construction effort directly. Bundeswehr combat engineers arrived in Poland to work alongside Polish troops, digging trenches, installing anti-tank barriers, and building field fortifications and firing positions along the Kaliningrad and Belarus frontiers. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, every country that shares a border with Russia, are now coordinating engineering work with Warsaw. Poland has also stood up an entirely new military formation, 4 dedicated brigades, specifically tasked with managing the infrastructure of East Shield and securing the corridor along Kaliningrad and Belarus. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is Poland, backed by Germany and its Baltic neighbors, physically building the permanent capability to seal that border whenever it decides the moment calls for it. And once East Shield reaches its planned 2028 completion date, the current 30-day rolling closures on individual crossings could become something structurally permanent. That's the trajectory Kaliningrad is on right now, and it didn't start with a war. It started with concrete trucks and engineering battalions. If you're starting to see the pattern here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this region is moving fast, and what happens next in Kaliningrad is going to matter a lot more than most people currently realize. And drop a comment telling us whether you think Poland is playing this the right way, because the next layer of this story is where things get genuinely tense. Because East Shield didn't rise out of nowhere. It exists because of a night in September 2025 that changed how every NATO government along that eastern flank thinks about Russian intent. On the night of September 9th into the 10th, Polish airspace was violated by at least 19 Russian drones during a massive overnight Russian assault on Ukraine that involved more than 415 drones and over 40 missiles across 15 Ukrainian regions. Some of these drones didn't just clip Polish airspace by accident. They lingered. They traveled deep into Polish territory, and Poland, for the first time since Russia's full-scale invasion began, engaged them directly. Polish F-16s and Dutch F-35s scrambled, backed by German Patriot systems, an Italian early warning aircraft, and NATO's broader multinational air response, and shot several of the drones down. Debris was recovered across an area spanning hundreds of square miles. One drone fragment struck a residential house in the village of Wirikiwola. Nobody died, but the psychological impact was immediate and enormous. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk told Parliament bluntly that the incident brought Poland closer to open conflict than at any point since the Second World War. Poland immediately invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, formally requesting consultations among allies over what officials increasingly described as a deliberate provocation rather than a navigational accident. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas called it the most serious European airspace violation by Russia since the war began, and later described it flatly as a game changer. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, when asked whether the incursion was intentional, didn't hedge much either, saying that whether it was intentional or not, it was absolutely reckless and absolutely dangerous. That single night reshaped NATO's entire posture along its eastern border. And this is the part where the story stops being just about Poland and Kaliningrad and becomes about the whole alliance recalibrating in real time. 2 days after the drone incursion, on September 12th, Rutte announced the launch of a new standing military activity called Eastern Sentry, designed to bolster NATO's air, land, and sea posture across the entire eastern flank, from the high north down to the Black Sea, with specific new capabilities built around detecting and countering drone incursions. This wasn't NATO's first move of this kind. Back in January 2025, following suspected Russian sabotage of undersea cables and pipelines beneath the Baltic Sea, the alliance had already launched Baltic Sentry, a continuous maritime surveillance operation using drones, warships, and submarines to protect critical undersea infrastructure. Add in Arctic Sentry, launched shortly after to cover NATO's northern flank, and by early 2026, the alliance had, for the first time since the Cold War, stood up 3 simultaneous, open-ended standing operations rather than time-limited exercises. Analysts tracking this shift have called it exactly that, a fundamental change from demonstrating readiness through scheduled drills to maintaining permanent, continuous deployment across multiple theaters at once. And the intercept numbers back up just how much more active this posture has become. NATO fighter jets tripled their intercept missions in 2025 compared to 2023, reaching roughly 570 separate operations along the alliance's eastern edge. This is where Kaliningrad's geography turns from a Russian asset into a Russian liability, because sitting right next to it is a strip of land barely 65 kilometers wide, known as the Suwalki Gap, or Suwalki Corridor, the narrow stretch of Polish and Lithuanian territory squeezed directly between Kaliningrad on one side and Belarus on the other. For years, Western military planners have treated this corridor as NATO's single greatest structural vulnerability in Europe, because it's the only overland route connecting the 3 Baltic states to the rest of the alliance. If Russian and Belarusian forces ever managed to link up and seize that corridor, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, more than 6 million NATO citizens, would be cut off from any land reinforcement entirely, reachable only by sea or air. Since 2022, Poland and Lithuania have jointly developed defense plans specifically built around this scenario, with Polish forces committed to helping shield Lithuania regardless of exactly where an attack originated. Finland and Sweden joining NATO has diluted some of that single-point vulnerability by opening alternative reinforcement routes through Scandinavia, but the Suwalki Gap remains the fastest, most direct overland lifeline, and it sits within artillery range of both Kaliningrad and Belarusian territory simultaneously. Now flip the map around and look at it from Moscow's side, because this is where the real anxiety inside the Kremlin starts to show. Russian military planners reportedly view a NATO effort to isolate Kaliningrad by sealing its land and sea borders as an increasingly plausible scenario. And in some assessments, they now consider it more likely as a first move than a direct military assault on the exclave itself. Kaliningrad's thermal power plants, even with the new gas and coal infrastructure built specifically for isolation scenarios, are estimated to sustain the region for only a few months under a genuinely complete blockade before serious shortages set in. And crucially, some Russian assessments reportedly interpret NATO's Baltic Sentry mission not as a defensive surveillance operation, but as a rehearsal for exactly that kind of blockade. Whether that interpretation is accurate or not almost doesn't matter, because it's shaping how the Kremlin prepares. Moscow has been intensifying contingency planning to help Kaliningrad withstand prolonged isolation, drawing uncomfortable comparisons to what's already happened in occupied Crimea, where sustained Ukrainian strikes on energy and logistics infrastructure have repeatedly exposed how vulnerable an isolated Russian-controlled territory really is when its supply lines get cut. If a full blockade of Kaliningrad ever happened, the only realistic route to relieve it would be an overland supply corridor punched through the Suwalki gap from Belarus, a process regional analysts estimate could take many months to establish even under ideal conditions, assuming NATO didn't contest it militarily the entire way. And here's the twist that makes this moment particularly dangerous rather than just tense. All of this pressure on Kaliningrad is intensifying at the exact same time that NATO's physical troop presence in the immediate region has been temporarily thinning out. More than 1,000 American troops recently left Lithuania as part of a routine rotation, and the timeline for their replacement units to arrive remains unclear. The core NATO battle group in Estonia numbers only around 1,000 personnel. Germany is in the process of permanently establishing a full armored brigade in Lithuania, but that kind of buildup takes years, not months. So you have a genuinely strange moment unfolding in the Baltic right now. NATO's political and economic pressure on Kaliningrad is at an all-time high. East Shield engineering brigades are digging trenches along the border. Sanctions enforcement is throttling supply lines, and 3 separate sentry operations are running continuously across sea, air, and land. But the actual troop density on the ground at this specific moment is going through a temporary lull. That's exactly the kind of gap that both sides watch closely, because windows like that don't stay open forever, and everyone involved knows it. So why doesn't Putin just retaliate harder? This is the question that actually explains why Kaliningrad has become such a uniquely painful problem for the Kremlin, because in nearly every comparable standoff Russia has faced elsewhere along its periphery, Moscow has had some kind of symmetric card to play. Not here. A serious military threat against Poland or the Baltic states would mean confronting NATO's Article 5 collective defense guarantee directly, something Russia's already overstretched military, bleeding manpower and equipment in Ukraine is in no position to risk. A harsher economic response is equally constrained, because Kaliningrad's own economy is now more dependent on decisions made in Warsaw and Vilnius than on anything Moscow can unilaterally control. Even Russia's most aggressive rhetorical responses, like the retaliatory consulate closure, end up costing Moscow more strategic visibility than they cost Poland. Every lever Russia reaches for either risks a confrontation it cannot afford or simply doesn't exist anymore, because the infrastructure that lever used to pull, the shared power grid, the open border crossings, the functioning consulates, has already been dismantled piece by piece over the last 18 months. Poland, for its part, has been careful to project confidence without recklessness, and it chose a very specific moment to make that confidence visible. On August 15th, Poland's Armed Forces Day, roughly 800 Polish military personnel marched through Warsaw alongside more than 300 units of ground equipment and 60 military aircraft in a public display of readiness, timed deliberately against the backdrop of everything unfolding along the Kaliningrad and Belarusian frontier. It's the kind of parade that reads 2 ways at once. A domestic morale message for Polish citizens living closer to this tension than almost anyone else in Europe, and a very deliberate signal outward, aimed squarely at an audience watching from across that 65-kilometer corridor. There's also a transport dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed outside logistics circles, and it matters just as much as the military buildup. For decades, the fastest way to move goods between Western Europe and the Baltic states ran through Russian-gauge rail lines inherited from the Soviet era, the same wide-gauge track that connects seamlessly into Kaliningrad and mainland Russia. That dependency is being deliberately engineered out of existence. Rail Baltica, a multi-billion-euro European rail project years in the making, is building a standard European gauge line running from Poland through Lithuania, Latvia, and up to Estonia, specifically designed to let military equipment, freight, and passengers move through the Baltic states without ever touching Russian-controlled rail infrastructure again. Every kilometer of that new line that opens is one more piece of leverage Moscow permanently loses. Because right now, a meaningful share of NATO's own reinforcement planning for the Baltic still has to account for old Soviet gauge track that Russia effectively helped design. Once Rail Baltica is fully operational, that dependency disappears entirely. And Kaliningrad's isolation, already deep, becomes even more structurally permanent, because the last remaining excuse for keeping any Russian-compatible transport corridor open through the Baltics simply stops applying. Step back and look at the full shape of what's actually happened here, because none of these individual moves looks dramatic in isolation. A power grid disconnection, a sanctions enforcement update, a 30-day border review, a consulate closure, a fortification project measured in kilometers of concrete. Individually, each one is the kind of story that barely makes international headlines for more than a day. But layered together, over 18 months, they add up to something genuinely historic. A NATO member state, without deploying a single additional soldier into offensive posture, without firing a shot, without declaring anything close to war, has managed to turn Russia's most heavily militarized western outpost into its most exposed and dependent territory. Kaliningrad still bristles with Iskander missiles and S-400 batteries. It still hosts the Baltic Fleet. On paper, it remains one of the most dangerous concentrations of Russian military power anywhere in Europe. But an armed fortress that cannot reliably move cargo, generate independent confidence in its own power supply, or guarantee its diplomatic channels stay open is not the same fortress Putin thought he was building when Iskander launchers first rolled into the region years ago. The weapons are still there. The grip around them is not what it used to be. There's also a quieter economic reality inside Kaliningrad itself that rarely makes it into the headlines, but shapes everything happening on the ground. Living standards in the exclave have always trailed the Russian national average, and residents there have spent years relying on cheaper goods and easier travel through Poland and Lithuania precisely because reaching mainland Russia by land is impossible, and reaching it by sea or air is expensive and slow. Every crossing that closes, every category of goods that gets blocked under sanctions enforcement, doesn't just squeeze the military supply chain, it squeezes ordinary households who used to cross into Poland for cheaper shopping or drive to Lithuania for routine business. That civilian pressure matters strategically, because a population that feels increasingly cut off and increasingly poor is not a stable foundation for the kind of long-term military posture Moscow wants to project from that exact same territory. Regional analysts who track this pattern closely have made the same point again and again. You don't need to conquer or blockade Kaliningrad outright to make its position untenable. You just need to keep making everyday life there marginally harder, one supply disruption at a time, until the cost of holding onto that forward fortress starts to outweigh whatever strategic value it was supposed to provide in the first place. What happens next depends heavily on decisions nobody outside a handful of ministries in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Moscow has full visibility into. Does East Shield reach its 2028 completion date on schedule, giving Poland a genuinely hardened permanent border it can seal at will? Does the temporary lull in NATO troop density in the Baltic close before tensions escalate further? Or does it stay open long enough to become the kind of gap military planners write cautionary reports about after the fact? Does Moscow ever attempt to test the Suwalki corridor directly, or does it accept that Kaliningrad's new reality, an armed outpost surviving on Polish and Lithuanian tolerance rather than Russian control, is simply the cost of everything that's happened since 2022? Nobody can answer that with certainty right now, and anyone who tells you they can is guessing. What we do know is the trajectory, and the trajectory has been consistent for 18 straight months. Less access, less supply, less diplomatic presence, less certainty, for the one Russian region that can least afford any of it. So what do you think happens to Kaliningrad from here? Does Poland keep tightening this squeeze one 30-day review at a time until East Shield is finished? Or does Moscow find some way to reverse a trend that's been running against it since that clock hit zero in Vilnius back in February 2025? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep following exactly how this pressure campaign develops week by week, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because this is one of the fastest moving fronts in the entire Russia-NATO standoff, and it's only getting tighter from here.